It's another Friday.
Boy, isn't it? Boy, I'm looking outside and we have those clouds you never have in New Mexico, those big fluffy clouds.
Well, I was, for us who are desert dwellers, high desert dwellers, the rain the last 2 days was so welcome. So I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was nice, wasn't it? Yeah, it was pleasant.
So I did a quick review of our topic today, and it's giving and receiving feedback. And this is a humbling one for me because can I tell you that this is one area that I really struggled with in my early years as a project manager. And it's something that I had to consciously learn and relearn and make mistakes and relearn. And I've probably got, I don't know, 50 stories, I'm going to say, of learning and relearning. So it's a tough subject. And for a lot of project managers, those of us who grew up in the technical ranks, things are black and white when you're a technician. But when you're dealing with people, black and white doesn't work as much.
Yeah, that's right. How again, it's like you said, a system or a thing is right or wrong, right? And you can correct things that are right and the system won't get upset at you. But that not so much with people and their behaviors.
And I will admit it took me a few years to get this. And I think now from a project management perspective, dealing with both my own staff and client staff, that I have learned how to give and receive feedback and have it both accepted and accept it for myself. So, but it is for many people, some people can do this naturally. For myself, it took a while. And I don't know what your experiences have been in this area, but this is a make or break point for a lot of project managers.
Oh, it was for me too. And by the time we're through, we'll see that my background is very similar to yours, Merv. I've had problems giving it, and it's not just in project management. It's being forthright and caring enough about somebody else's behavior and the relationship with them that you're willing to go into unknown territory and take a risk.
I remember though, when I turned the corner, I was in a situation where we'd been working a project and our project manager made a very serious faux pas on the project. The project had been struggling anyway, and this was kind of one of those last straw moments. And eventually the client asked our team to basically wind it up and leave. And it was largely because of a huge faux pas on our project manager. Well, I ended up being sent to another project several states away, began working on that, and our vice president came in and began to give me my annual review. And part of the annual review was a review for my previous project manager, i.e. the one who had committed the major faux pas. And he began to tell a whole bunch of untruths about what had happened and how I was the one, and he was beginning to give me a lot of feedback that was untrue. Now, in my earlier years, and I'm saying earlier by maybe a year or two, I would have absolutely got my hackles up and began to defend myself vociferously. Mm-hmm. But in this case, I thought, well, in my mind, and I've been learning to take feedback, in my mind, I kept saying, but that's not true. That's not what happened. That's not. And so what I did was I pulled up on my computer the previous 6-month evaluation, which was just a few months earlier than all of this had happened, from that very same project manager, which was glowing. I mean, I walked on water in that review. And so when I presented that to the vice president and he looked at what was happening here, what was written on that, he realized that no one could turn that bad that quickly. And basically I ended up finding his good graces again. But instead of going to the logical approach, had I gone to my old approach of defending vociferously, I probably would have been canned right on the spot. So yeah, there's a good way to get feedback. And a lot of it comes from just keeping cool, just the facts, ma'am, and go from there.
Yeah, and you know what else? We have to admit, and we may touch on this a little bit. It takes a lot of courage. You're stepping out into an uncomfortable area that
Yeah.
people don't like to talk about. And in fact, a lot of organizational cultures say, no, that's not how you treat people. They'll figure things out. We're smart. You don't have to challenge them on their behavior or anything like that. But if you can learn to do this well, you can catch issues before they're major.
Well, not only can you catch issues before they're major, and that is such a key thing on projects, but also if they kind of escape and become a little bit of a problem, just the way you handle them can diffuse it and correct it fairly quickly. So all through the process, whether you catch it early or catch it later, there's great rewards in being able to deal with this in a professional manner.
Let's get our terminology correct. You know me.
Somehow I knew you'd have a definition.
Well, it's the teacher trainer in me.
Yeah.
And my students always demand that I have a very precise definition. So criticism and feedback, and they're used interchangeably. How do you use them? Or do you just want me to spell out what the definitions are and let's play?
Yeah, let's go with your, I assume you're going to do a formal definition, or is this a Tim definition?
No, these are formal. These
Okay.
are precise definitions.
Yeah, let's do that.
Criticism is expression of disapproval based on perceived faults or mistakes. It's analysis and judgment of merits and faults. Okay, that's criticism.
Okay.
Feedback is information about reactions to a person's performance of a task and used as a base of improvement, which is interesting. Okay. Now, what we're talking about, faults or mistakes, I would assume are human behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Feedback is about human behavior too, because it's speaking directly to what we call a person's performance.
But I noticed that when you told us about feedback, the word judgment wasn't in that.
Yes, yes. Analysis and judgment. And not only that, but feedback is not the performance itself. It's the reaction to which is totally different. Like I feel.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel, I think. You acted in this way and your actions forced me to think in this way or behave in this way. So it's reactions and not the facts itself. So we have two things. We have criticism that sounds a lot more stringent and a lot scarier, but it's direct and to the facts. And then we have feedback, which sounds nicer and more gentle, yet it talks about what I feel and what I perceive, and not necessarily the facts themselves.
So the feedback part, I want to talk about the criticism too, but the feedback part could also be, besides being directed at me, I feel that your actions in this situation, this is how they affect me. But also you can say, I have observed that when you were in that meeting, the reactions of your client counterpart was this. So that could be feedback too. And then you could basically say, here's how you might want to try this in the future in a situation similar to that. So feedback, I think, is the observation plus the advice, I think.
Yeah. And again, that last part of the definition of feedback, used as a basis of improvement.
Yes.
This is a foundation for improvement, where you don't have that explicitly laid out in criticism, which is interesting.
So the criticism part, I once belonged to an organization which we got rid of the word criticism and we exchanged the word evaluation for criticism. So in many ways, it was the same process, but I think people are used to the fact that there is a judgment aspect to criticism. And so evaluation, although it did the same thing, seemed to be a softer approach than still had the judgment component, but it seemed to be softer than the word criticism. And people seem to take evaluation, and basically what we were taught to do in this organization was we said, here's where I can see that you can improve. That's the judgment part. And here's where I can see that you are doing very well. So the criticism or the evaluation is both the improvement area and the part you're already doing well.
Yep. That makes a lot of sense. Now, we'll leave that for now. I think we'll come back to these definitions.
Yeah.
But for right now, how do we receive criticism and feedback? Because if we have a way that we receive it, we can understand basically how we'd like others to receive it too. So how do you receive criticism and feedback? What are your general rules to get the most out of it?
Well, my first rule is don't interrupt. People have this way of thinking. The first words they hear, they're already formulating their response. And so they stop listening and they're formulating their response. And then at some point, they just want to jump in. So my first approach to receiving criticism is to listen actively, not passively, but actively to the entire criticism or evaluation or whatever you want to call it leveled at me. And then be able to, once that person is finished, then be able to respond with an agreement or a partial agreement or a rebuttal or something. But first point for me is to listen carefully and completely.
Yes. And that active listening, ensuring that you are getting the correct information. Okay, I heard this. Is this what you're saying?
Right.
It'll slow down the conversation, but it makes sure that you're getting the right information.
Well, I mean, in concert with this, I was in a situation on a project where my counterpart had observed something in a meeting. He'd come in late, but he had observed something in the meeting, and he pulled me aside afterwards, and he said, "Do you realize what you just did in there?" What he had missed in the first 5 minutes was a bit of kibitzing back and forth. And so the kibitzing back and forth had set the tone for how I was conducting myself. And the person that I was interacting with was in on the joke because we were kibitzing. But in this situation, he hadn't observed the early part. And so when he came in and leveled his criticism, pulled me aside, leveled his criticism, I was able to quietly explain to him through active listening in terms of, what did you see? No, that's not what happened. Here's what happened. And was able to kind of level set at that point. So yeah, listening to the whole thing actively is so important.
You're pointing to something too. The strategies that you're using here are all an attempt to slow things down. You're trying to comprehend, you're trying to gather all the information, you're trying to convey the context, and you're not rushing into an emotional response.
Yeah.
One of the things my consultant trainer, and he eventually became a mentor of mine too, said was, whenever anybody gives you something, especially information, when they give you information, first thing you say is thank you. Even if it's bad information, even if it's just somebody yelling at you, take a breath and say thank you, because they gave you something. They gave you something to work on in order to put together a healthy response. And the worst thing you can do is jump down someone else's throat when they're jumping down yours.
Yeah.
And when you're in criticism, it's their opportunity to share what they perceive. It's a perception or an opinion, but it's still valuable information.
Oh, it is. And I think what you also were talking about in terms of slowing down, we need to be careful not to react. Because the reaction, a lot of people have hot-headed approaches to things. And it's that reaction that can escalate as opposed to diffuse.
But,
Now,
and go ahead. I'm sorry.
no, you finish your thought because I had something else came to my mind.
Okay, so this is normal for humans. This is what's kept us alive for all these millennia. It's basically the flight or fight or freeze response.
Yeah.
And this is totally normal. And we as managers and leaders have to expect that of people. And it takes months, if not years of work to actually discipline this ability to not just jump and take action. Now, there are times you need to take action like this, but it's not when somebody's trying to tell you something that they think will help improve you.
So if I was a young project manager listening to what you just said, you have just given me comfort when you said it takes years to get good at this. It just does. But what I was going to say earlier was I, like you, am a reader of ancient writings.
Uh-huh.
I like the old philosophers, one of the writings that I've read, and I've read this a few times now, are the collection of wise sayings by an Israeli king, one of the earliest Israeli kings, called Solomon. And not only was he wise and had laid out a bunch of his own wise sayings, but he also collected them from other places, other countries, and he collected them all in a book. And it's in the Jewish writings. I forget which part of the writings it is, but it's called the Proverbs. And one of the Proverbs that I remember very specifically is a slow answer turns away wrath, or a quiet response turns away wrath. And so if they recognize that thousands of years ago, why do we still have the issue today? No, it's a soft answer. A soft answer turns away wrath. That's what he said.
Yeah, it's the human nature component. Yeah. It's something that's built into our hard wiring. It keeps us alive. It helps us jump out of traffic when we're surprised. And we don't want to get rid of that, but we need to corral it in some way. And that's what takes practice. It's just like having a wild horse. That wild horse is strong. You want people with strong emotions because these are the ones who care. Yeah. You don't want people who are just sitting back. No, you want the people who are passionate. You want the people who are willing to get into arguments. And then you can work with them and help them with that discipline to help them grow.
So if we know how to take criticism, or if we know how we like to take criticism, and I'm going to go back to the word evaluation. I still like that word better.
Okay.
If we understand how it is that we like to accept evaluation or feedback, what can that teach us in terms of how we give evaluation or feedback? What do you think?
Yes, we give in the way that we desire to receive. Exactly. Yeah. This is why we start with a core of emotional intelligence and self-awareness. The awareness of the internal mechanisms I have. What are my triggers? What are my general responses? How do I respond to angry and sad and aggressive people and bullies, and understanding that? And then the emotional intelligence. How do I work with my emotions? How do I control them? And how do I also, part of emotional intelligence is, how does this thing called relationships work? And how can I participate in being better in relationships so the relationships can be stronger? And once you learn that about yourself, once I learned that about myself, it made a lot of this, giving criticism, receiving receiving feedback, all of this stuff, it made it a lot easier. Because again, I learned this thing that silver-haired guys tell the younger people: pump the brakes, take a breath, relax, think it through carefully, and then provide a logical response. I had to learn my own mechanism before I started understanding others, though.
Well, and I think that part of the key where you were also talking about in terms of the individual response, how to respond this way and that way to depending on what's coming at us. I think this is incumbent on the project manager to truly know his team or her team. And the reason I say that is because one person responds to one mode of evaluation or feedback differently than another person would in that same situation. So when you know your staff or your team members or your client team members, when you know them fairly well, you can provide feedback in a way that they will accept it, as opposed to
Right.
sort of one size fits all.
Right. So let me paint you a picture of this, okay? And this is a really neat story. This was my years before project management, and I was a head waiter. I was a shift waiter, managing maybe 25 to 30 waiters, 5 hosts in the front of the house, right? And I was working with the general manager. And the general manager came up to me one day and said, okay, I don't want you to be alarmed, but this guy is talking behind your back. And I need you to actually work with him and work out a working relationship. And I said, great. And he said, oh, by the way, you're going to sit down, you're going to have a one-on-one with him. And I want you to use this as a practice activity. I said, oh, great. Basically, he was teaching me through this. And so I got the host when he came in, and we sat down at the empty bar in the back. And I said, I observed that that you're not working directly with me as the other host. Is there a reason? He said, no. And it was like, 1 banana, 2 banana, 3 banana. He didn't say anything else. And I said, I've had other people come to me that you're talking about me in a negative manner. Is there something you need to express? And he said, no. It was like, I couldn't elicit anything from him. And I finally said, okay, what's the matter? How can we build a relationship that we can work with? He said, it ain't going to happen. I don't like you. And it was like, I learned that there are sometimes criticism and feedback are never going to get what you want. And you just have to figure out a way to work around these things. It's an obstacle, and it's not going to get better. And it hurt my ego more than anything else. But then I realized that, human beings are human beings, and you can't go further than that.
Well, and that's a good thought, because we teach techniques, we teach awareness, we teach a lot of things, even in these podcasts, but there's no magic pill. And sometimes, no matter how good we are at what it is that we're talking about today, it doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted by the other person. And your example is a perfect example of a situation like that, where you probably tried a number of things to get that person to work with you in a harmonious way, and it just didn't work, because for whatever reason, he might not have liked the cut of your hair. He might have, who knows, but he just decided. And so, yeah, there is no magic pill, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to work through these situations.
Right. They're all opportunities for growth. They're all fuel for the fire. And this is something that actually allows us to see beyond how we're doing things today and perhaps do them better.
Well, and one of the techniques that I've used, we talked about techniques for accepting feedback. One of the techniques I use for giving feedback is something I learned in an organization called Toastmasters International. And that's the whole idea there, is that we give immediate feedback to a presentation. And part of what we're taught, and part of what we learn to do very well, is something called the Oreo cookie, or you may have heard the sandwich method or something.
Yeah, I learned it as the criticism sandwich. That's right.
Yeah. And so you lay out something that the person did very well, then you lead into an area for improvement, and then you finish up with again some sort of praise or adulation for performance, so that you don't ever cut back on that middle piece, the meat of the cookie or the meat of the sandwich. You don't cut back on that. you still want to give that message, but you temper it with things that the person is doing well. Because after all, every team member is not an utter failure in every situation. They all contribute well, but there are certain areas that you want to give feedback in, and there's a way to do that that doesn't backfire in your face.
You know, there's something else that I learned that works really well. It's even before the project starts. It's setting a certain culture. And one of the things that I do in all my classes, and I've done it with projects too, is basically say, you know, here's how we're going to argue, and I talk about the values, and here's why we're going to argue in this way. And then I say, you know what, we're going to have the ability to have a relationship such that if I see your behavior as wrong, I can step in and help you improve that without it attacking you. And you can do the same thing for me. And then I go into great detail. This is not a discussion of people. We don't change people. We change behaviors. And this establishes the fact that people and behaviors are two separate topics. A lot of people think my actions are me. And if I can get somebody to think in a different way, where my actions are an outcome of what I think about the world, it like distances them from their actions. And then we can criticize the actions without attacking the individual and the individual's perception of their own value.
So if you have a team member who is responding to another team member in a harsh tone, you may want to take the person aside and say, you spoke very harshly to your colleague, which is different than saying you are a harsh person.
Right, exactly. Right. Or I would even abstract it even further. And I've played with this. Did you notice the way you talk to this person? And I would say this harsh tone puts up boundaries, doesn't it? To ensure acknowledgement. And then say, what would happen if this behavior were changed? Taking the person out of the discussion totally.
Yeah.
And this is where you can actually have a totally objective discussion, where all of a sudden our behaviors are not us, but they're tools to allow us to be more effective, and we can choose the tools we want.
Yeah. Well, and I think part of the practice starts with, for those of us who are parents, starts with our own kids. You have to be careful. I mean, you can't just say, well, that was a dumb thing to do, because they take it as I'm dumb.
Right, exactly.
You know, so
it's totally human behavior.
Yeah.
This is the beautiful thing. I don't want to get on a soapbox or anything, but this is the beautiful thing about teaching from a values standpoint.
Yeah.
If my actions are outside of me and I value my actions, people criticizing my actions criticize me. If I value a beautiful car and somebody criticizes that car, that attack is on me. If I value being wealthy and somebody else says wealthy is horrible, they perceive that as an attack on themselves. But if I can actually create something that I value that's inside me, that's a part of who I am, first of all, it can't be taken away from me, like a car can. But second of all these things that people criticize and people have opinion on are not going to have any effect on you.
Which, by the way, is why I stay away. I don't stay away from social media, but I stay away from topics that elicit those sorts of responses. So, I think I'm a much happier person when I go to bed than many of the people that I happen to glance at what they're responding at how they're responding on social media. So I'm with you totally there.
Isn't that fascinating how most of the online communication is there to not just elicit a response, but to elicit a personal, very visceral, very emotional response?
Yeah, it's just amazing. Things that they wouldn't say to that person in person.
Yeah, and again, this they do to actually make sure you remember brand. But what we're talking about is using it for the betterment. It's like the force, right?
Yeah.
Where there's the light side and the dark side. And what we're looking at is the light side of the force and how to use it for positive change.
Well, and I brought that up, even though it doesn't really, that particular subject about social media, even though it doesn't really pertain to what we're talking about, giving and receiving feedback. What it does, though, is kind of remind people that there are those avenues that they don't, that they get caught in, either giving or receiving. And so how do they feel in those anonymous forums? And therefore, what can they even learn from that bad behavior that they can bring onto their teams and make sure that that is not shown in life?
So you're exactly right. And to that extent, these social media environments are great training grounds for us to explore our personal triggers, our own attitudes, and places where people may unintentionally hurt our feelings without them understanding. And it actually allows us to take those landmines out of our territory and have better conversations.
Oh, exactly. And one of the reasons that I tend to not respond, or if I do, it's in a humorous way or something along those lines, so that people are not offended, or if they do take offense, it's in a kind of a humorous vein. But part of that is because even now, if I bid on a contract, I know I was in a situation where I was being interviewed, and all of a sudden that flashed my LinkedIn. The person while interviewing me was looking through my LinkedIn profile. People are very savvy. And so whatever you sow on those social media websites can come back, and you can end up reaping things you don't want to.
Oh, they will.
Yep.
Yeah, gossip. Gossip is funny. We think of gossip as negative, but gossip is intended and unintended communication, and it's a survival mechanism in small groups to make sure that critical information spreads really quickly. So there is a positive side of gossip, but we have to understand, as a tool, it can be very dangerous too. And so with our criticism and with receiving criticism, we have to be aware that this human behavior is around this, and the criticism before and after the giving and receiving. I'm not talking about keeping it confidential or anything, but we just have to observe that this communication is more or less going to be public.
Yeah. And yeah, you just assume that. So have you, by the way, have you ever had a situation where the feedback situation, now you gave us a story about being the head waiter and dealing with the other person, but have you had other situations where maybe giving or receiving feedback did not receive its intended result?
Yes.
I probably had a dozen or more.
I have so many. I had a manager who I thought was really powerful in active listening, and I thought he had great composure. And one thing he came back to me all the time with is, Tim, I just don't understand you. Tim, I don't know what you're saying. Tim, you're confusing me. And it's like, okay, let me try this strategy. Let me try this strategy. Let me try this strategy. And I got to the point where I was saying, and again, this was just about 8 or 9 years ago. It got to the point where I was actively engaging in trying to pull criticism from him so I could figure out what I could do with the behavior that was obviously getting in the way. Nothing. And it's funny, we have to realize that people communicate information that's inside them, which is their perceptions and observations of the world and their filters. And he wasn't communicating something that I understood that I could change. He was communicating his confusion, and he was communicating this. And if I was smart or smarter, like I am now, I would have built a strategy not based on how I could effectively communicate, but how he could actually improve through strategies that I could change.
So you could give him feedback about his feedback.
Well, yeah, exactly. And I replayed that. This was so impactful to me for months after I left that organization. I replayed that in my head before I was going to sleep at night, right? And one of the things that I thought that I would have liked to have tried was building a strategy where we had a formal structure of here's how we're meeting, here's when we're meeting, this is the information we're sharing, and did you receive this information? Did you know what to do with it? Not to actually contain his confusion, but to actually provide the communication that was most effective for him, not the communication that would improve me.
Yeah, I had a situation that was not dissimilar, but I was part of an organization where people could present their ideas. And one of the young men that was in the organization was presenting an idea on how to get funding, or he was making a presentation to say people who could fund an idea that he had in terms of beginning a new company. And so there were several of us who then were tasked with giving feedback after he completed his presentation. And so my feedback went something along the lines of, well, I'm not familiar with your industry, but if I were a money backer, if I were a person that you're asking for funds, here is how it came across to me. Now you can, I may be way off base or I may not be way off base, but just to hear what I'm saying and how it came across to me. And then I proceeded to tell him how I found issues with, not issues, but holes in his argument in terms of he didn't answer certain questions in my mind as he presented this. He got very quiet. And that evening, he sent me the most vile, filth-laden email as to how stupid I was in terms of I don't know anything. But anyway, besides the fact that he did this, I realized, and so I responded back, not in kind. I just responded and said to this young man, I said, I apologize for how it came across to you, but understand this, that if you got that same feedback in real life, is this how you would treat your potential benefactor? And at that point, he went silent. But the point was that sometimes, even though you're honest, and even though the rules of the game are established up front, sometimes feedback just fails.
Right. And that was one of the questions I was looking at. I've been evaluating a lot of questions. This is one of the reasons why we're talking about this today. A lot of students have questions in my classes about giving and receiving feedback. What's the best way to do it? What's the best way to give? And what's the best way to receive? Yeah. And one of the questions that I've found really compelling is, how do I know when feedback won't work? Because when you can't provide feedback to a team member, there may come a time when you have to replace them. We don't want to do this. So how do you know you're getting close to the point where your feedback will not have a positive effect?
So I'm trying to understand the question. So he's not saying, how do I know when feedback won't work in advance? Therefore, I shouldn't even give feedback. He's saying, as I'm giving feedback, or she's saying, as I'm giving feedback, at what point do I know it's not going to work? Is that a better way of?
Yes. I like the second question. Yeah. That's more to the heart of what he was giving.
Yeah. For me, when I'm giving feedback, yeah, actually in any communication, when I'm one-on-one with a person, I am watching for every telltale sign, facial tick, body language, shift, whatever it takes to understand how they're receiving what I'm saying. And there are absolute communication that are nonverbal from the person receiving my message that tells me whether they're leaning in and accepting or whether they're sitting back and just kind of not understanding or not accepting. So I think the whole active listening part we talked about earlier, I'm also an active presenter. I'm taking it all in as I'm presenting. So that's my first clue.
Okay.
Thoughts on it?
Yeah, and me so. I'm looking for their armor.
Yeah.
If people are relaxed, they'll give you information and they'll receive information. Communication cannot happen when people have their armor up or when they're protecting themselves.
Yeah.
So you have to create an environment that people are comfortable and relaxed in.
Yeah.
And if they're not, it's not a time to give criticism.
Well,
Go ahead.
well, and I was going to say, and obviously, besides the nonverbals, if they're verbally just coming in, interrupting, and keep on giving you their feedback while you're giving them feedback, they're not taking it in. And so at some point, you just sort of have to back off and say, okay, I need to do a course correction here. I need to understand how to get my message across without this person being so defensive or so, intrusive in terms of what I'm saying.
So much of criticism and feedback has to do with understanding the other human and understanding their side of the story,
Yeah.
their perception and opinion.
I think I shared with you at one point, dealing with people. For example, I had a young person on my staff who I learned later had a father who was overly critical all the time while she was growing up. Overly critical. She could never do anything right. If she came home with 95 on a test paper, he's asking her why she didn't get 100. It's sort of those sorts of things. And so the first couple of times when I gave some feedback and it was not accepted, in fact, it was kind of, I could see her recoil. I didn't understand because other team members would take the feedback in stride and as a result of that, begin to course correct their own behavior. But what I learned afterwards was because of this overly critical nature of her father, and I was old enough to represent that same father figure, it was something from her past that prevented her from accepting the feedback in the way that I was giving it. Once I learned that, I was able to change my approach with her, and we became fast friends. But it takes that knowing your staff, your people, in order to be able to provide that feedback.
I had a vocal coach in university when I went to college the first time, and he had a huge ego. And he was very well known for being very stubborn, very driven, and very directed. And I was going to be studying under him for 2 semesters on personal coaching, on singing. And the first half hour of the first hour, he sat down. He said, "Tim, you're not going to like me. I'm not a person that you're supposed to like. Okay, take that off the table. We're not here for a relationship. Okay, I'm here to get you to become a better singer. That's it. If you take my criticism with that mindset, we're going to get along great. All I ask is that you listen to what I say and you attempt to respond to what I say in a manner that you can actually try what I'm providing you. I know this stuff and I know it well. All you have to do is listen to me and try out what I'm telling you to try, and then we'll see where we go from there." He set that expectation. He set that expectation of no relationship plus the discipline it took at that level of my career to refine where I had been working for almost 12 years to actually get value out of an extremely good coach.
See, now that makes a lot of sense. If you can work with your staff or your peers or your management in a way that they know you first and so therefore know what to expect from you, that makes giving and receiving feedback and evaluation, criticism, that makes it so much easier, so
Well,
much.
yeah, and think about critical projects. If you're working in a nuclear facility, you're going to be yelling at people before they push a switch, right?
Yeah.
And setting in when you're in a project that's high pressure, this is almost a requirement. I've thought about this and talked about this in my classes. There are times when it's very difficult for us to actually be casual and relaxed. We have to really work on this stuff. And this lays back to what I wanted to talk to you about as our last topic. I'm going to be doing this as a project manager. Are you comfortable with team members doing this among each other? Or is this something that should be reserved just for the project manager? This is another question one of my students asked me.
Not only am I comfortable with it personally, I encourage it because, you know, I've led teams of 300-400 people. You can't be everywhere at all times. So you have to kind of work through your team leads. You have to have those team leads work through their senior staff. But even on smaller project teams, as a project manager, I am not in the details. And as far as things like the development portion of the project, I left programming and all of that stuff long time ago. So if I want, you know, developer A to learn how to do a better job, he's not going to get that feedback from me. If he is treating my customer incorrectly, I might be able to step in. But more importantly, when it comes from a peer and it's delivered in the way that we've been describing, in a way that's maintaining that person's, you know, respect for the individual, I encourage that. What better training ground for my future project managers than to be able to deal with their peers on their projects?
Yes, I agree with you totally. Again, this ensures that the kickoff meeting is going to last about 24 hours. But, you know, talking about these things and setting up the ground rules around giving and receiving criticism. We had to attend, what was it, a 4-hour class when I was hired to a corporation on here's how you argue, here's how you give and receive criticism. These are the boundaries we're going to have. These are the terms we're going to have. And it seems so, you know, so you know, constrictive, but at the same time, it was almost liberating because it gave us the ability to do it correctly and effectively from day one.
Yeah, and I tell you, sometimes, you know, going back to my father figure example, that young woman probably would have accepted the same feedback from one of her peers a lot more easily than she did from me initially until I learned of her background. So peer-to-peer is, I think it's an amazing way to run a team, especially, we've talked about this before, the whole idea of self-organizing teams.
Yes. And yeah, it takes mature, responsible individuals who are ready and open to this level of performance, but it's worth it. This is where real magic happens in projects. The people who understand the mechanics of humans and relationships and how to take advantage of that knowledge to make things better.
But think of this also, if you're a project manager and you're watching peer-to-peer feedback that's not going well, what a teachable moment.
Oh yeah. How do I step in carefully?
Yeah.
And don't take the credibility of the one giving criticism while I help them become more effective. Again, what we're talking about is really close to personal emotions and personal value, and you have to tread very carefully. And for many of us, These teachable moments are make or break moments in our leadership path.
I have a book on my shelf and I don't remember the name of it. It's been a while since I've read it, but it's something along the lines of the I message. So when you're presenting feedback, you do it in terms of how it affects you, not the person. So if you come across and say, well, you did this, then it's almost comes across accusatory.
Yes.
But if their behavior has an effect on people, including yourself, you can say, well, when I noticed this behavior, this is how it came across to me. So you're putting yourself into the position, not you into the position.
Exactly. You're not talking about the other person. You're talking about the event and the result of the action and the individual. Brilliant.
And by the way, so my wife's not here right now, so I'm gonna rat her out just a little bit. All of these years of marriage, I have yet to be able to train her how to load the dishwasher.
Uh-huh.
But you know what I learned from all of that? It doesn't matter. Who cares? She has her way. I have my way. At some point, it doesn't matter the feedback. It happens. The dishes still get washed, right? So there are some things that even in the giving and receiving of in the giving of feedback, just let it go.
And you know, that's where analysis, being data driven, is so valuable, because it takes those human motions away, and you're no longer solving people problems, you're solving data problems. And people can abstract out there, and we bypass all of this, like you said, accusatory activity.
Yeah. So can I rewind just a little bit? We've got a couple of minutes, and I just want to come back to something. I think you would ask the question, are we trying to change people or are we trying to change behaviors?
Yeah.
And so part of, I think what I want to say to that is, much like we talked about motivation, I don't know that we can change behaviors either, but I think, like motivation, we can create the environment for the person to be able to make the changes within their own behaviors. Do you think that's more accurate, or do you think?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yes. Yes, thank you. Behaviors are an action that I do.
Yeah.
And nobody can change my behaviors. I have to do it. And it's the same thing with you and your behaviors. And so all you can do is motivate and influence and persuade and create an environment such that it is easy for people to change their behaviors, right? They let their guard down, they play with new ideas, they don't stick to their guns, and they're looking at an opportunity to grow instead of staying where they are right now. It takes time. It takes 6 or 7 weeks just for people to let their guard down. And you can imagine how long it takes to build a culture where people are willing to try new things, much less, let their guard down.
Well, and even now the project, I don't know about your most recent experience, but mine has been, not only are you trying to create a project culture, but you're trying to do it with people who are from various cultures and who have different upbringings and different belief systems and that sort of thing. And it, to me, it adds to an incredible diversity of thought, diversity. I mean, it's a fun situation, but the giving and receiving feedback has to be very carefully understood, because not everyone from every culture takes feedback in the same manner.
Right, right. My Indian friends in my classes will take anything I say verbatim as the law. And I have to be very careful with that. My German friends will sit back and say, okay, I'll take it or leave it. My Israel friends will say, that's where you're wrong, Tim, because here. This is where you're right, Tim, because here. And you're exactly right. And we have to read the crowd. We have to read the individual.
And this is why I think, and this is a little off topic, maybe not so much. This is why it's so important for the project manager to be human, to go for coffee, to have lunch with staff, to invite people into the office for casual conversations about last night's, in my case, I don't understand this, but last night's cricket match or something along the lines, so that you develop that relationship that allows you or gives you permission to then, as their boss, if we're talking about project management team situations, where it gives you permission then to be able to apply feedback or to give feedback and apply their feedback as well.
You know, we're going to do a show on telling stories, because I've read many articles where telling stories takes people into that space that's safe, where everybody can share the same story, and it's not talking about an individual. And I would love to spend time talking about how we can use storytelling to create that environment you and I are talking about.
So can I tell you a story about that? Because I'm
Yeah.
loving this. I'm loving this. And this is kind of in the feedback vein as well. I have a very good friend who is a professional speaker, also a professional speech coach, and her audience tends to be executives of Fortune 100s, 500s. And she was brought in to help a CEO give a, I think it was an annual address to his shareholders or something along those lines in a year when the company had not done very well. She was paid very handsomely. I mean, in the like 4 zeros behind the number for a single day. And the number was, anyway, it was a good amount. She listened to his presentation and it did not go well. So she sat down with him and started asking some questions. And from that came a story. And she helped him craft a story. And that story is what he used to lead off his presentation. And he wowed the crowd, not so much that they forgot the fact that this was not a good year, but at least they were lenient towards him as they worked towards solving what the company's issues were. So I agree with you. Let's do a podcast on storytelling.
Good. Thank you for that.
And as part of her feedback, I wish I could remember the whole story, but her feedback was accepted by him. This 7-figure CEO accepted feedback from her, applied it, and it worked. Wow. So again, I didn't want to leave the feedback part of it out of this.
So thank you very much on that.
Let's end on this note, but I think another great conversation. And if I was a young budding or even a already skilled project manager, I think I would listen to this and take some of these pointers to heart.
Yes, at least try them out. At least try them out and experiment with them.
Exactly.
So where can we find you, Merv, if we have questions?
Well, I have my website, peoplefirstprojectmanagement.com. Probably for questions, the easiest way would be to find Merv Jersak on LinkedIn or through my company name on LinkedIn.
Good. And yeah, I can be found over at LinkedIn, Tim or Timothy Jerome. I'm one of the very few out there.
Yeah. With 2 first names, right?
Oh, more than that, believe me.
Yeah. All right. It's been a great podcast, fun as usual. So let's connect again next week and we will surprise our audience with a new topic.
Thanks again, Merv. And thanks to anyone listening. And please provide your comments and questions and we'll respond in time.
Great. Until next week.
Thanks again.